In 1793, a British sea captain gave a Hawaiian king a small, seemingly harmless gift: a handful of cattle. Neither man could have known that this one decision would help build one of the largest privately owned land empires in American history, or that within 4 generations it would very nearly slip away entirely. At its peak, the family behind that empire owned so much land on the island of Hawaii that a person could ride for days without ever leaving their property. They controlled more private acreage than almost any family in the United States, along with cattle, political influence, and a direct bloodline to Hawaiian royalty. Today, almost none of it belongs to them. No war took it from them, no scandal exposed them, no single disaster brought the empire down. What actually happened is stranger than that, and in some ways more unsettling, because it is the kind of thing that could happen to almost any fortune, built by almost anyone. Their story begins with a teenage sailor who abandoned his ship on a whim, and it grew into a fortune spread across more than 500,000 acres of volcanic grassland beneath Mauna Kea. Understanding how this family rose means understanding an island before it had roads, before it had ranches, and long before anyone imagined that a runaway sailor from Massachusetts would become one of the most trusted men in the kingdom. His name was John Palmer Parker, and the dynasty he founded would become known across Hawaii as the Parker family. What he built would outlast him by nearly 2 centuries. What his descendants did with it is a very different story. That 1793 gift was almost an afterthought at the time. The king, newly consolidating power over the Hawaiian Islands, declared the cattle sacred and forbade anyone from touching them. It seemed harmless enough. Cattle do not stay small in number for long. Within a few decades, the descendants of those first few animals had multiplied into thousands of wild, half-feral cattle roaming the uplands of Hawaii Island, trampling crops, destroying property, and occasionally goring the people who got in their way. The very law that protected them made them almost impossible to stop. Nobody was allowed to hunt animals that belonged to the king. Hawaii had, without meaning to, created a crisis that only someone willing to break the rules, or someone the king personally trusted, could solve. That is where a 19-year-old from Massachusetts entered the picture. John Palmer Parker arrived at Kauai Harbor in 1809, working as a ship's clerk on a merchant vessel that had sailed around Cape Horn. Rather than continue the voyage, he left the ship behind and stayed. Over the next several years, he earned the trust of Kamehameha's court, eventually traveling to China during the War of 1812, where he acquired a modern American musket unlike anything else on the islands. When he returned to Hawaii, that musket became his ticket into history. The king granted him permission to hunt the wild cattle that everyone else was forbidden to touch, and to sell the meat and hides for profit. It was the beginning of Hawaii's cattle industry, and it was built on the labor of one foreign sailor with the right weapon at the right moment. Then came the marriage that sealed his place in the kingdom. In 1816, Parker married Chiefess Kibikane, granddaughter of Kamehameha. The union tied a foreign sailor directly into Hawaiian nobility, and it meant his children would carry royal blood. For a king trying to modernize his kingdom while keeping outsiders in check, rewarding a loyal, capable, now family-connected foreigner with land and privilege made political sense. What started as a contract to control a pest problem had quietly become the foundation of a dynasty. By 1847, Parker had saved enough to purchase land of his own near the base of Mauna Kea, at roughly 3,500 feet of elevation. He built a modest home there called Manor Hale, and what began as a small cattle operation slowly grew. When the Great Mahali reformed land ownership across Hawaii in the late 1840s, allowing private citizens to buy and hold land for the first time, Parker expanded aggressively. To manage the operation, Spanish and Mexican vaqueros were brought in to train Hawaiian ranch hands, creating the paniolo, Hawaii's own cowboy tradition, taking shape well before the American West had fully developed its own. By the time later generations took over, the ranch stretched across hundreds of thousands of acres, eventually growing past 500,000. To put that in perspective, that is more land than the 5 boroughs of New York City combined, several times over, all of it privately owned by one family on a single volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific. It became one of the largest privately held cattle ranches in the entire United States, a scale so difficult to picture that visitors were often told a person could ride for days without ever leaving Parker land. For a while, it seemed unstoppable. The Parker name meant wealth, land, and access to Hawaii's most powerful political circles. Family members sat on royal councils, attended elite schools alongside future monarchs, and hosted lavish gatherings that blended American ambition with Hawaiian tradition. Their homes filled with imported furniture and fine art, their daughters counted princesses among their closest friends, and their influence stretched into nearly every part of the island's economy, from cattle and land to shipping and trade. To outsiders, the Parker dynasty looked less like a family and more like an institution, the kind of empire that simply does not end. But empires rarely fall all at once. They tend to erode decision by decision, and for the Parkers, that erosion began with a grandson named Samuel Parker. Inheriting a share of the ranch as a teenager after John Palmer Parker's death in 1868, Samuel grew up surrounded by wealth and Hawaiian nobility, close enough to the royal family to later serve in the kingdom's last cabinet. He was not reckless by nature. He simply believed, as many wealthy heirs do, that the fortune he had inherited was large enough to fund both prestige and reinvestment at the same time. He hosted extravagant gatherings that earned him the nickname the King of Hawaii in the local press. He pursued political ambitions that required money, connections, and constant public presence. Slowly, protecting the family's core asset became less urgent than protecting the family's image. That shift proved costly. In the late 1870s, Samuel diversified into the sugar industry, then the most promising business on the islands, buying into the Pauhauhau plantation and later investing directly in the Pacific Sugar Mill near Waipio Valley. On paper, it looked like smart expansion. In practice, the mill suffered from years of mismanagement and the investment failed. To cover the losses, part of the ranch itself was mortgaged. Meanwhile, Hawaii's political ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet, as the monarchy Samuel had served began losing power, culminating in the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893, an event Samuel was personally involved in as the government's negotiator. Each setback compounded the last. A failed investment led to a mortgage. A mortgage led to dependence on outside management. Outside management led to conflict within the family itself, as Samuel and the ranch's newly appointed trustee disagreed over whether income should fund expansion or fund Samuel's lifestyle. Samuel believed he still controlled the ranch outright, and went so far as to claim, in court, that the entire property belonged to him alone. The trustee disagreed, and the disagreement escalated into a lawsuit that dragged on for years, tying up the family's most valuable asset in legal fees at the exact moment the kingdom itself was disappearing around them. Hawaii had gone from an independent monarchy to a republic to an American territory within the span of a single decade, and the political shelter that had once protected families like the Parkers no longer existed in the same way. By 1906, the pressure had become unsustainable. Samuel sold his remaining ownership interest, and control of the ranch shifted permanently away from direct Parker family management into the hands of professional trustees. Over the following decades, the pattern repeated itself in quieter ways. Heirs died young. Ownership passed to infants and widows who relied on hired administrators rather than family members. By the time the ranch's last direct descendant, Richard Smart, inherited the entire operation, trustee-controlled management had already been in place for a generation. When Richard Smart died in 1992 without children of his own, he left the overwhelming majority of Parker Ranch not to a relative, but to a non-profit charitable trust created to fund healthcare, education, and community support in the surrounding region. Parker Ranch still exists today. It still runs cattle across the same volcanic uplands John Palmer Parker once hunted with his musket. But the family that built it no longer owns it. There is something almost poetic about that ending. The empire survived, the dynasty did not. No war ended the Parker fortune. No natural disaster wiped it out. It disappeared the way most family fortunes actually disappear, not through a single catastrophe, but through a long accumulation of choices that each seemed reasonable at the time. A sugar investment here, a mortgage there, a lawsuit nobody wanted to have. History is full of families who mastered the art of building wealth and never learned the far harder skill of preserving it across generations. Building an empire can take a single lifetime. Losing it, as the Parkers discovered, often only takes a few.